So for tonight's class, we're going to talk about this week's Torah portion, which is a double portion, Matot-Massei. It is the end of the book of Numbers, which in Hebrew we call Bamidbar. Now, Bamidbar doesn't actually mean numbers. So it's actually a different name than what we call it in Hebrew. It's not a translation. So Bamidbar means in the wilderness. So what we are doing in the wilderness is we are getting ready to go into the promised land. Now, if you are interested in the notes for tonight's class, you can click on the link that I have posted in the chat room. You can also left click on, library, I want to say. And that will give you the ability to go to the OneShul library, click on Parshat Matot-Massei versus Kol Nidre, and that will give you the notes. So you can flip back and forth between the notes and the video screen. You can just follow the notes and listen to me. You can do whatever you want. But the link is there in the chat room. So, Matot-Massei versus Kol Nidre. So I'm going to start with a premise. And the premise is that vows connect the desert, Bamidbar, in the desert, to the last words of Torah. The last book of Torah, Deuteronomy, is actually Devarim, which means words. The world as we live in now is very different than the one that the persons in the Torah lived in. But the one thing that remains true is the fact that our vows connect the desert to words. Okay, so those are the two premises that I want to act within. So I want to pose a question to start. This is where that fun interactivity stuff happens. Do you think, number one, that our words are important? And the second question I would ask, and you can answer one of these questions or both of these questions, is, do you think that the world we live in now is fundamentally different than the world of the Torah? So the setting of the Torah, the actual narrative. Now, values are timeless and things like that, but let's talk about the setting of the Torah, and maybe the values as well. Actually, I'll lump that all together. Do you think that the Torah time, if you will, is different, the same, fundamentally different, and do you think that our words matter? So I'll give you a moment to answer those questions. It looks like George says yes. Welcome, George. Michael says, our words are very important, a hard lesson for many. That is very, very true, Michael. Any other thoughts, comments on vows, on words, on the things that we may say, the promises that we make, the differences between the time of the Torah and the time of now? Michael says the times are the same, just different technology. Okay. Raul Ray says words are important. The setting is different, but the premise is the same. Okay. George says, I prefer to think we are doing better. Okay. Cool. Okay. Anyone else have anything to say? So Abby says, I think people... Whoops. I just lost what Abby was saying there. I think people think times and people are very different, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay. So maybe we want to think times have changed, but they haven't. Rivka, who I enjoyed speaking with earlier today. Words are valuable, but unable to communicate those most important emotion and ideas. So that's very valuable. So there's a limit to the power of our words. So whereas everyone else is talking about the power of words, maybe there's actually a limit to how powerful our words can be. So that's a very interesting dynamic. Lori says she totally agrees with Rivka. Well, I guess I should have just let Rivka teach this class, because Rivka is apparently winning us all over. And normally Rivka does. If you haven't been to one of Rivka's Torah studies, I highly recommend going. Okay, so I'm going to side with the idea that we live in a fundamentally different world than the world of the Torah. And I'm going to give a very glossy, easy example of that. We're going to read the first part of Parshat Matot, or Matos, depending on what part of the world you live in. This is not to be confused with Mentos, which is the fresh maker. And so this is Numbers 33 through 17. So 33 through 17, through 30:17. And I want you to pay attention to a few ways that I word things. I'm going to try to put accents on certain phrases. So I'm going to set this up. So what this is going to talk about is the idea of vows, and specifically when a man makes vows and when a woman makes vows. I want you to try to pay attention to each of these areas, and if you want a cheat sheet, look at those notes. Okay, so when a man voweth a vow unto the Lord, or sweareth an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word, he shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. Okay, does someone want to summarize that? And I will read it one more time for people that want to type it. When a man voweth a vow unto the Lord, or sweareth an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word, he shall do according to all that proceedeth out his mouth. What's the simple English, man or woman on the street way of saying that? George says, keep your word, okay? There you go. Keep your word if you are who? Who has to keep their word? Does an elephant have to keep its word? An elephant may never forget its word, if it can speak. Abby says men have to keep their word. Okay, so men have to keep their word. If a man makes an oath, he has to live up to it. Now, what's interesting about this is that it puts a responsibility on the man, that he has to live up to a certain expectation. Is this radical at all? Does this seem like a crazy idea? Does this seem like anything that's particularly revolutionary? Again, I want to go back to my original premise, which is that we live in a different time now than the people did then. So in the context of back then, would this have seemed like a crazy idea? George says yes. Okay, so why would it have been a crazy idea back then that a man who swears an oath has to live up to it? And it says a man, so, the word is ish, so that's any man is called ish. Is there a particular reason why that's wild or fascinating or interesting? The ideas of white lies run through our society. Okay, so that's a possibility. Is there anything else, though? Let's think about the time that this is written in. Let's think about the way people lived back then. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the Pharaoh. He's the king of Egypt. What he says goes. His thoughts and feelings and whims are the will of the universe, and he gets to say or do or think whatever he wants. So Raul says keeping one's word back then was probably more important since contracts were mostly spoken and communities were smaller. Okay. Now, this is interesting, of course, because Abraham lied. He told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. Okay. So these are all great points. They're actually completely different points than what I had thought about, so I'm really excited about that. And that's half the fun of OneShul, is that we come up with our own ideas, and that's really what community is about. It's about us all sharing in this stuff together. So I'm very proud that we have that. My thought was that this was actually a very radical idea, that a man had to live up to what he was supposed to do. And the reason why is that who is going to judge him, right? So we are told that we should have a system of justice, but what kind of system is that? And who's going to be responsible? And if you look at a lot of nomadic cultures, there was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of lying, and a lot of deceit, and a lot of robbery, and things like that. So to be told that the God of the universe, the head deity, the head power over humanity, wants you to keep your word is a pretty big deal. And that this applies to ish. It applies to a man. Okay? So that means it applies to men. It applies to all men. And as George mentions, this runs contrary to what some people in the Torah have done, like Abraham. Now, Raul makes an amazing point, which was that, back then contracts were primarily oral, so it would have been very important to keep that together, and the communities were smaller. So what's really interesting to me about that, and I appreciate that insight, Raul, is that in a book that I've been kind of reading on and off called The Evolution of God, one of the arguments that the author, whose name escapes me, mentions is that ethical monotheism may have grown out of a legal need. That if you lived in tiny, tiny communities, stealing your friends, or neighbors, I guess, shovel, there didn't need to be a moral law behind it. That you would have known that someone stole your shovel, and where would he have hid it anyway? So, maybe there's something to that as well. And so George makes the comment that even our grandparents' generation, people shook hands and kept their word. Absolutely. I mean, I've made several agreements like that. I actually had a guy I made a deal with, and it wasn't even that big a deal. I don't even remember exactly what it was, but when he shook his hand, he said, let's call it a gentleman's agreement. So, absolutely. Okay, but this is still interesting. So we've determined man makes an oath, he has to live up to it. Okay, here's the next part. Also, when a woman voweth a vow unto the Lord, and bindeth herself by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father heareth her vow, or her bond, wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her father holdeth his peace at her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. Okay, so I'm gonna break this into parts because it's a lot of sort of old Englishy language, and the reason why it is that I'm using the 1917 JPS, so it's this very old Englishy kind of sounding stuff. So I know it can be a little complicated. So I'm gonna kind of translate this a little bit. So you have a woman, and she makes a vow. This is just like the man made a vow. Being in her father's house. So she's in her father's home. That's a euphemism for she lives under her father's protection. She's not married. It also says that she is Na'ar. So she is a youth. And her father... Okay, so she's a youth. She's in her father's home, which means she's not married. And her father hears her make this vow, and the father decides that he's fine with that. That's what hold his peace means. It means he's fine with it, he doesn't care. Then that means that all of her vows should stand. Okay? So let's break that down into something even simpler. Does someone want to make a single line, a single sentence statement for all of this ifs, thous, and voweths, and untos, and all of that stuff? What does that say? What did I just say in that sentence? I'll read it one more time. When a woman voweth a vow unto the Lord, and bindeth herself by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father heareth her vow, or her bond, wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her father holdeth his peace at her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. I can see everyone is terribly excited about translating that, because it sounds absolutely horrible, right? What does it mean? What's the moral of this very, very, very long run-on sentence? What does this tell us about women? What does this say about the role of women? What does it say? Rivka says she is being protected, okay? Raul says it sounds a little misogynistic, like the vow only counts as long as her father is okay with it, okay? So one person calls it protection, the other person calls it misogynistic. What does everyone else think? Come on, we've got a lot of women in this chat room tonight. Don't tell me you don't want to chime in on young woman in her father's home. She makes a vow, he hears it. As long as he doesn't say anything about it, then it's okay. No one has a single thought about that? Rivka says, in her father's presence and having his blessing, she can make a contract. Okay? So Rivka's looking at this from a contract law perspective. So she's a minor, and she has to have the father's blessing for this. No one else wants to chime in on that? I am shocked, frankly, because I thought this was just going to be a shiv in the stomach. Okay, Abby says, men decide whether her bond stands or not. Okay, I'm sorry. Abby, when men decide whether her bond stands or not, knowing that in most situations men can override a woman's bond, okay? Raul says, well, in that context, it doesn't seem so bad. Abby says, I don't see it as protection. And Rivka says, check box for over 21 to enter. Okay? So, interesting points. Let's see. Lori says, being a minor, it sounds like protection to me. George says, I believe this means to be moved to our culture. Okay, so now, as I mentioned earlier, there's two words, basically, that are used here for the woman, okay? So it actually does say, as an English translation, when a woman, okay? So typically when we think of woman, we think of someone who's over 18. I mean, in our culture, woman would be over 18. Maybe we would say young woman is a word we would use for, say, a teenager. You know, we wouldn't say that a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old is a child per se, but we wouldn't really say you're an adult either, right? It's kind of a gray area. But then it also goes on to say being in her father's house and na'ar, all right? So what this is implying is that she's a woman, but she's in her father's home and she's in her youth, okay? So this could be talking about a lot of different kinds of women's statuses, women's situations, okay? So we could be talking about an unmarried minor, so we could be talking about someone under the age of 12 or 13, okay? So that's one option. The second option is that she is over the bat mitzvah, what we'd call the bat mitzvah age, but she's not married yet. So she could be, under, whatever would be a marryable, over the marryable age limit, but still kind of young. So that might be someone around 16 to 18. You have to remember, going back to our previous comment, different times, different situation. But we know she's young and we know she lives at home. Okay, so at least we know that she wasn't married, right? And that she will know a little bit more about what her status is. It gets inferred at the end what this person's status is. But we know that she's a young person and that she's not married. Abby makes the point of saying that the idea of protection, well, okay, but it only applies to women, so is it really protection at that point, right? And Michael makes the comment, makes you wonder what kind of world this was. So I'll give you an excellent example of this. Last night, my girlfriend and I were watching TV, and we were catching up on TV shows that everyone else in the world has watched, but we haven't watched yet. So we watched The Tudors, which is the TV show, it's the Showtime show about Henry VIII. And there's the betrothal of King Charles to Mary, who is the daughter of King Henry. And they do this betrothal. It's like the 5th or 6th episode. She's, I think, about 5, and he's 20. And they even make a comment about how they have to wait 10 years for them to get married. And there's a little bit of a flub because later they say 12, but she's definitely older than 2 years old. So it's, it's kind of a little bit weird. But we were watching it, and it was gross. I mean, it was really gross to see this because, they brought the King Charles, in, and he, picks her up like a small child and kisses her on the cheek and says, one day we will be married. And it's just disgusting and horrible. And you get so shocked by it. But that was not strange for that time, right? So when we think about these ideas of, what is a woman, what is not a woman, what are the father's rights and things like that, you really have to think about it. Lots of comments now. George makes the comment that a woman being married at 14 was not uncommon. I think my great-grandmother actually was married at 15 or 16, so there you go. In sociology, you're taught in ancient society, did not have the concept of adolescence. Great example of that, let's look at the bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah that you have when you first start puberty says you're an adult by Jewish law. We maintain that tradition. Would we ever give a tween, as we would call, a young teenager, would we give them full adult rights? Probably not. I hope not. Adolescence, Abby makes the comment here, adolescence is a very new idea. And Guest 100 says that grandmother was married at a young age. So, there you go. All right. So, let's read the next part here. But if her father, so now we're still talking about the young girl, but if her father disallows her in the day that he heareth, none of her vows or her bonds wherewith shall bound her soul shall stand. And the Lord will forgive her because her father disallowed her. Okay. So I'd like someone to interpret that. But if her father disallow her in the day that he heareth none of her vows or of her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. And the Lord will forgive her because her father disallowed her. So what do we think about that? What does that mean? Okay, so Michael says, if he stops her that day. Okay. So, what we're hearing here is the parallel to what we heard earlier, which is father hears what the young woman, the girl, says, and he's passive about it. Okay, then he has her consent technically, and she can do whatever. But if he disallows her the day is what it says, that he hears what she says, then none of it is bound. She is not halakhically required to do whatever it is that she swore she was going to do. He has the ability to disavow whatever she said she was going to do, to disavow its spiritual relevance in that moment, and God forgives her for whatever statement she made that she now is not going to live up to because her father annulled it. Okay, so as Michael says, she is not culpable. And so George says this is because women were chattel. Okay, so now we're starting to get some strong statements here, right? We're starting to feel some strong things about this. Okay? Whatever she said, whatever she bound herself to, if her father hears it in that day and says no, it's over with. He has that right to do so. It's one of these, you're in my house and you're my daughter and, I'm going to make you do whatever you do. But this is very interesting because it says, and God will forgive her, right? So this could be a statement like, I swear by God that I will not stop until I will not stop working until my family is no longer hungry. And so he has the ability to go in and say, no, you can't swear that. You can't swear to God that you are going to do XYZ thing because there's no way you can do that, right? Or he can say, no, you can't swear by God that you are going to commit XYZ act because it is a moral act, or whatever the case is. George says the father needs to get a life. So maybe. Okay. But this is what is being said here. It does not matter. The sacred and the secular are in the same place in this time in history, right? So if a 13-year-old signs a contract for a cell phone, the father clearly has, or the parent, guardian, has the right to say, no dice, you can't get a cell phone. The whole thing is null and void, right? But if a 13-year-old prays to God, please, please, God, I'll be good if you make it snow so I can get out of school, in Judaism, the father has the right to say, no, that's not an appropriate blessing. That's not an appropriate thing to ask of God. And you are not going to be good if it snows. You're going to be good anyway. Your vow does not count. Okay? And in Judaism, the cell phone contract and the vow with God for a snow day, if she promises to be good, same deal. It's the same basic principle. It's making a vow, binding your soul, binding yourself to an agreement, to a solemn promise. Okay? So whether it's, I agree that I'm going to pay for a cell phone, or I agree that I'm going to do my homework regularly if I can just get out of school, it's the same. In the world of Torah, it's the same exact thing. Okay. So, now we'll read the next part here. This is a long one, and this talks about the woman, if she has a husband. If she is married while her vow is upon her, or the clear utterance of her lips, wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her husband hears it, whatsoever day it be that he hears it, and holds his peace at her, then her vow shall stand, and her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. Okay? So, what does that mean? What does it mean that on the day he hears her? Who does that remind us of? This is the husband. He says, and it's saying here there may be vows that she's taken before they got married. They're married now, or maybe she made a vow while they were married. What does the husband get to do? And I'll read this one more time while everyone's typing. And if she be married to a husband while her vows are upon her, or the clear utterance of her lips, wherewith she hath bound her soul, and her husband hear it, whatsoever day it be that he heareth it, and hold his peace at her, then her vows shall stand, and her bonds wherewith she hath bound her soul shall stand. What does that mean? Who is the husband replacing? Okay, so George says he owns her. Okay. But who is the husband replacing in this case? There's someone here that this husband character sounds like. Abby nailed it. Abby said it. The husband replaces the father. Okay, so now it doesn't say when she is living in the husband's home. It doesn't make this comment about living in a person's home. It merely says if she has a husband, and the husband hears what this vow is, on the day that he hears it, he gets to choose to nullify it or not. And so the first sentence basically says here, if he hears it and he's at peace with it, then her vows stand. So then it goes on to say, but if her husband disallow her in the day that he heareth it, then he shall make void her vow, which is upon her, and the clear utterance of her lips, wherewith she had bound her soul, and the Lord will forgive her. Okay? So, the exact same role as the father. Now, here's an interesting sentence. This is the next one. But the vow of a widow, or of her that is divorced, even everything wherewith she hath bound her soul, shall stand against her. Okay? What does that mean? So I'll read a few of the comments here. Looks like we got some good comments here. Raul says, so apparently women are considered too feeble-minded to make a contract of her own. Lori says, in this case, it sounds like control rather than protection. Michael says, I don't know if that's implied, but controlled, yes, if she diverts from husband's interest. Okay? So what do we think about this next question? But the vow of a widow, or of her that is divorced, even everything wherewith she hath bound her soul, shall stand against her. Abby says, so, widows and divorced women must keep their word, and no one can annul it. Bingo. There is no man to annul your vows. So the vows that you make are the vows that you keep. There's no interceding person who is going to make that decision for you. Now, let's think back to what we said earlier. We're in a different time. So, why widows and divorced women? Well, there's a pretty simple reason. Women didn't live on their own. So, women were either under their father's protection or they were under a husband's protection, right? The only other option would be that women would be concubines, right? That's the only other status that a woman would have, would be that of a concubine. Now, you cannot have Hebrew concubines. Now, we can go into all kinds of stuff about, slaves and things like that. But that's the deal. So, if you're a widow or you're a woman who is divorced, then that's all you could be. Those are the only two circumstances in which you don't have a man. Now, you could be a widow who doesn't marry for a long time. You could be a divorced woman that doesn't remarry for a long time. But, that's it. That's what your status would have been. All right. So, interesting stuff. Now, what's interesting here, this next paragraph or this next sentence, and if a woman vowed in her husband's house or bound her soul by a bond with an oath, and her husband heard it and held his peace at her and disallowed her not, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond wherewith she bound her soul shall stand. Okay, so that sounds an awful lot like the previous statement that we heard a couple sentences back, right? I mean, it sounds like the same exact thing. Why would you repeat it? Well, the reason that it's repeated is that basically it's saying he can't take it back. So let's kind of visualize this. You are a woman, and you are married, and you make the comment, I swear that I am going to give the first fruits of our harvest to the poor, instead of to the temple, let's say. And the husband kind of thinks to himself, I don't really like the temple that much anyway, so yeah, we're going to give the first fruits to the poor directly instead of the temple. And then he kind of gives himself a day, and then he thinks, if I don't give my first fruits to the temple, everyone's going to know. It's going to be a sin not to do that. I better tell her we're not going to do that. He now can't say, woman, we're not going to do that, and I'm the husband, and I said so. He heard her. He was at peace with it. That was fine. She made a vow she was going to do something, and that is that. It is that simple. So while you can make the arguments about things like misogyny and sexism and the role of women, this does have an interesting precedent, which says that, if the husband or the father, who in theory is a party who is active in the woman's life, doesn't say then and there, I don't want you to do this, or that's a vow you can't keep, he doesn't have the right, if he says it's fine, to then go back and say no. I think of it as the example of women in the workplace in the 60s, women who said, wow, I'd like, or the 70s, or the 80s for that matter, heck, maybe even now, women who say, I've had my children, I want to go back to work. The husband says, okay, whatever is going to keep you off my back. And then later he says, no, I want you to stay home and cook the dinner. You can't go work. Well, under Jewish law, in this time, in this Torah time, that would have been unacceptable. She made a vow that she was going to do something. Vows are sacred. Vows have spiritual meaning. He can't go back on his word, right? So this is actually an interesting cycle, if you think about it. So we ended on, if a wife makes a vow, the husband says he's okay with it, then he decides to take his word back, he can't. Okay? Let's assume he did. Let's assume he took his word back. What rule, what mitzvah, what commandment has he broken? So he's broken a mitzvah here. He's broken a commandment by saying to his wife, you can't do the thing which you said you were going to do, which I was okay with, and now I've decided you can't. Michael says dishonoring his wife. Nope, not quite. It's right in this Torah portion. Think of it as a circle. We're going back to the start. So what did he do? What was the rule that he broke? By saying to her, Abby got it. He's not keeping his word, right? Okay, so here's how this works. She says she's going to do something. By him not saying, you can't do that. So I know that's a double negative, but we'll use that visualization exercise again. Wife says, I want to give the first fruits of our harvest to the temple. Husband says, yeah, whatever, temple. Or rather, I don't want to give the first fruits to the temple. I want to give them to the poor. Husband says, yeah, poor people, whatever, I don't care. So then she gets her basket of fruit. She's about to go to the poor. Husband says, no, I don't want that. He stops her. He says, I don't want you to do that. She says, you said that you were okay with it, or you didn't say anything to me. You ignored me. He's now broken Torah law because by not saying something and then deciding that he wants to take back what he said, or in this case it was implied that he said, he has broken the rules. He's broken the rule of not keeping his word because there's implied consent. When the translators of the JPS in 1917 said kept his peace, or kept his peace at her, what it was saying is that when you hear someone say something and you don't jump in, you have given your consent. By not speaking up, by not saying something, you have given consent to that person. You have given the authority to that person to do whatever it is that they're going to do. He is dishonoring his word by trying to stop her from doing something that goes against his word to begin with. And in this case, even though he didn't say something directly, he just said, whatever, or, he just didn't want to get involved, he's still breaking the rules. Because he did say something. He said something because actions, the action of doing nothing, in this case, speaks louder than words. Does that make sense to anyone? Does anyone have any questions about that? Can we see how this is going full circle? Okay, sounds good to everybody. Okay, so I want to jump to this last final piece. What is the big thing about vows? Someone mentioned something that involves vows. It's going to be coming up in the September-ish time period. What's a big vow thing that happens every fall in Judaism? Does anyone know? Kol Nidre. You got it. Raul nailed it. Kol Nidre. So Kol Nidre is Aramaic. Kol means, it can mean all, it can mean every, and Nidre comes from the word neder, which means vow. So it's all vows. Now, tell you a little bit about Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre, we think of Kol Nidre, which is this sort of long operatic chant that's done by the cantor, the musician, the chazan of the synagogue. It's this this very sort of powerful, dark, loud-sounding chant. Sounds like a piece of opera. We think of that as being sort of a spiritual thing, right? So we hear this depressing violin music in some cases. It's this booming voice, and it's supposed to be something that's supposed to just really kind of put ourselves into this kind of sad place, right? But here's the funny thing about Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is not spiritual at all. It's actually a piece of legal writing. Okay, so I'm gonna read this to you. This is the actual English text. So it's sung in Aramaic, which is a language similar to Hebrew. Some people would call it Bablio Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew. It's technically its own language, Aramaic. It's a language that was spoken by Jews in the Second Temple period and later. So here's the English translation. All vows, so that's what Kol Nidre, all vows. All vows and prohibitions and oaths and consecrations and konams and konasai and any synonymous terms that we may vow or swear or consecrate or prohibit upon ourselves from the previous day of atonement until this day of atonement, and from this day of atonement until the day of atonement that will come for our benefit. Regarding all of them, we repudiate them. All of them are undone, abandoned, canceled, null and void, not in force, and not in effect. Our vows are no longer vows, and our prohibitions are no longer prohibitions, and our oaths are no longer oaths. Doesn't exactly sound like the most sort of holy, liturgical, transcendental, sort of this kind of stuff, right? It's not stuff that really thumps in your chest and makes you think about being a better person, right? Not at all. It's this very legal-sounding language. It sounds like you're reading a contract. All vows, that we have sworn from, this period to the next period to the current period to the period of the future, regardless of all of them, they're all undone, null and void. Right? That sounds like something you would sign in a contract to get out of like a lease, or to get to write your title over of your car to like a title loan company or something, right? It doesn't sound like this like spiritual thing about angels and the new year and the souls of the Hebrews and all of these other things. It's a very technical piece of language. Now the origin of this is unknown. But what's interesting about it is that it started off on Rosh Hashanah, okay? But it was moved to Yom Kippur. Would anyone know why you might move the Kol Nidre, which is the ending of vows, the cancellation, the annulment of vows from Rosh Hashanah, our New Year, to the Day of Atonement of Yom Kippur? Does anyone have a sense for why you wouldn't want a vow-canceling piece of liturgy, legal liturgy, on the day that you would celebrate a new year? So George says we had no connection with the temple when it was destroyed. Okay, so that's possible. There's kind of a funny reason why, though. Let's think about this for a minute. Rosh Hashanah is New Year's, right? And so why would you not want to have the power to cancel your vows on New Year's? So George makes the comment, Yom Kippur is the day of fasting. Yep, so that's another great reason to have Kol Nidre during this time. But is there maybe another reason specifically with things that happen on New Year's? Think about secular New Year's, at least in America. What's something that we do on New Year's? Raoul says because we have that week to try to make up for past mistakes. That's another great reason. Abby nailed it. New Year's resolutions, okay? So how often do we think in this next year, I'm going to do XYZ? I'm going to do XYZ thing, and, I'm going to lose weight, and I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to sleep, I'm going to stop sleeping in late, and I'm going to get a better job, and all these other things, right? You wouldn't want to have the ability to annul your vows on the same day when you have the temptation to make all kinds of crazy vows, right? It doesn't make sense, because what people are going to do is they're going to hear Kol Nidre, okay, all of our vows are done, whatever the case is, and then people are going to ask you, so, what's your New Year's resolution? So that's why they moved it to Yom Kippur. It's a total... Kol Nidre, yes, it has all of these spiritual, beautiful meanings. I love the idea of it being connected to the temple and fasting and having a week to make tshuva, but there's like this underlying kind of non-spiritual reality to it, which is you don't want to have the ability to annul your vows during the same time when as George is saying, you're going to party it up and you're going to make tons of vows. Now, how many people on a New Year's party are drinking and saying, oh man, next year is going to be my year, I'm going to do XYZ, right? You don't want that during the same time that all of your vows are annulled. So that's why it was moved. Very, very practical story there. Now, the Kol Nidre used to read from the previous Day of Atonement until this Day of Atonement. So what you're doing is you're canceling all of your vows from last Yom Kippur or last Rosh Hashanah, depending on what time of, what period of time you lived in, depending on when Kol Nidre was being said, to the present day. So then Rashi's son-in-law, Meir ben Samuel, actually added in an extra part, which is that you have absolution from the previous Day of Atonement until this Day of Atonement and from the future. So when you hear Kol Nidre and you are having your vows removed, it's your past vows to your present and your present for 1 year forward. So you're actually sort of like paying, you're sort of annulling your vows in the future tense, which is kind of interesting. Like you're saying in that moment, everything that I've done in the past that I couldn't live up for, it gets undone today. And by the way, I know in the next year I'm going to have this same thing happen to me, so let's go on ahead and cancel out all those vows as well. Now, there's a lot of weird anti-Semitism stuff that happened as a result of people learning about Kol Nidre. Why? Why do you think anti-Semitism might happen as a result of knowing that the Jewish people have this custom of Kol Nidre? Put yourself in the shoes of an anti-Semite. Why would something like Kol Nidre be a little bit disturbing to you? Okay, so Raoul and Michael nailed it. It sounds like you could lie and break your contracts at will. It sounds like we can't be trusted. Okay? So, and George says people think we don't keep our word on contracts. Okay, so people heard about Kol Nidre, and they thought, okay, well, those darn Jews, they are going to make deals with us, and then it's going to be Kol Nidre, and then they're just going to say that their vows are undone, and then they're going to cheat us. Okay? So the thing about this, though, is that Kol Nidre does not exempt us from vows that we make with other people. So people get confused by this. It does not exempt us from the vows that we make with other people. So you can't promise someone a week before Yom Kippur that you're going to do something, and then on Yom Kippur decide you're not going to do it. Now, this has to do with the fact that if you look at the original language of the Aramaic, which I don't have here, and Aramaic isn't a strong language for me anyway, The words like vows, prohibitions, oaths, consecrations, they're not exactly appropriate words. They don't exactly explain what it is that you're undoing, but the vows basically are vows with God. And so, that's basically the issue. The vow has to be kept, and Raul, you're totally right. Sometimes we don't think before we speak, and so a vow is kept because we want to, and that's absolutely true. I agree with you completely, and that is a very fair way of interpreting that. So no need to blush as you're saying you're blushing. No need to. So really, it's not about that. It's about solemn promises that you make to God. It has this spiritual kind of meaning because let's remember again that in this time, an oath that's made, whether it's we use the cell phone example, the cell phone contract, or the praying for God to make it snow and you'll be a better student in school. It's the same kind of deal, right? So that's what this is. Now, the other thing that it does is it gives, it provides for the permission of the community to allow exiled people to come in and pray. So if you are a sinner, if you're an outcast, if you're a person who has done wrong and you have been shunned by society, you actually have the right during Kol Nidre to come in and to pray. So that is the other benefit of Kol Nidre. It gives everyone the opportunity, even people who have been pushed out of society because they are so terrible, to come in and to have their vows, their erroneous vows forgiven. Another point I'd like to make about vows, people often say, as a way of convincing Jews that there has to be a Messiah like Jesus, is that you could not keep all of the commandments and you don't have a temple anymore, so what Jesus does is Jesus gives you the ability through faith to the ability to have a temple. Basically, Jesus is the ultimate temple sacrifice, and that's the only sacrifice you need. And since there is no more temple, that's what all the Jews should do. They should convert to Christianity. And that this goes back to the idea of vows. Now, of course, there are tons of theological reasons for this to not be true, but when it comes to sacrifices, when you give a sacrifice, the sacrifices that you actually sacrifice for are the sins that you commit on accident. Okay, so it's the vows that you broke on accident would be a great example of a sin that you have on accident. That's what the offerings were. Everything else allowed teshuvah, allowed personal repentance. And that's why we have a custom during the high holidays that we say to people, if I have wronged you at all during this year, I hope that you will forgive me. And it's the custom, and hopefully everyone does, you're supposed to forgive them. And that's the rule. So, as the prophets taught us, God does not want our sacrifices, God wants our obedience. So, how can we be obedient? I think in this case, it's to keep our promises, to keep our vows. Vows are important. All right, so I have a few announcements to make. We have, Rosh Chodesh services, 8 p.m. on Thursday. That's 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time, with Ketzera. Ketzera is wonderful. If you have never been to Ketzera's Rosh Chodesh services, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go. They are absolutely beautiful, very healing. There's a lot of chanting. There is a lot of singing. There's lots of healing. I mean, that's really what she's all about. She's the voice of healing. Maybe I'm the voice of destruction. I don't know. But, she's the voice of healing. And anyone that my mother likes is a good person. So I highly recommend that you come on Thursday, Rosh Chodesh services, 8 p.m. A few other things. As I mentioned before, it costs at least, minimum, $120 a month to run OneShul. That's just for the chat room and for the video. That's just that, right? So we need your support. There's 11 people here tonight, all right? If everyone gave $15 to $20, that would cover a month. That would cover a month. Let's cover a month tonight. And I want to connect this to the idea of vows. Every person who is in here has made a vow. They've made a vow that they believe that Jewish community online matters. They believe that free online Jewish education matters. You believe, by being here, that there needs to be an online synagogue that's entirely pluralistic, from Orthodox to anywhere else on the continuum. You believe those things. You are making a vow. You are voting with your time. We've spent a little over an hour together tonight, which I am grateful for. I would like to give more people that opportunity. This is a community that's built on love. That's what we have. That's what makes us unique. And that's what makes us special, because every single person in this chat room believes that they have a moral responsibility to the Jewish community. How many synagogues have you gone into where people won't talk in class? They just sit there. The rabbi or the teacher doesn't want to hear what you have to say. If you click on any of the names and any of the people in the chat room who have logged in, you can become friends with them on Facebook or on Twitter. How many people at your local synagogue come up to you and say, "I'd like to be your friend"? Not many, unfortunately. I was asked, and I'm going to actually talk about this in a podcast that's coming up. I was asked by a rabbi friend of mine, conservative rabbi, what the future of synagogues were. And I got to tell you, I think the future of synagogues are bleak. And I think that they're bleak not because of movements and not because of Jewish law or programming or any of these other things. Here's what I think makes synagogues bleak. I think they're bleak because of the fundamental importance of sacred, intentional community and also of brit, of covenant. People should know that when they walk into a community that they are loved and wanted and appreciated. And their personal needs need to be met. And I promise you this, I and everyone else here at OneShul, Katsira, Rivka, Arnie Samlin, everyone who volunteers here, Jeremiah, Jeremy, everyone, I'm forgetting so many names, John and Kim, everyone who volunteers here, we all care about you. We care about you. We want you to have a good Jewish life, and we want this community to be fantastic. We want everyone to know about it. There is no reason why we shouldn't have 300,000 people coming to services and coming to classes. There's no reason in the world why we shouldn't. We need your help to do that. At the bare minimum, we need to be covering that $120 a month. Minimum. Think of how, if you give more, how much more we'll be able to do. Think about what an extra $20 a month could do. Think of the ads that we could post on websites. Think of the social media stuff we could do. Think about the events that we could go to. Matter of fact, Rivka drove from, I want to say, Kentucky to Pennsylvania, Philly maybe, somewhere around there, to go to a conference just to pass out OneShul flyers. And Rivka did that on her own money. Think about if we could empower people to go to every Jewish conference and talk about OneShul. Think about that. Think about if we could do that. How great our community would be. How much bigger it would get. How many more people could know that they're loved by God and know that they're loved by the Jewish community online, that they are loved by OneShul. I want you to want that. This community loves you. I want you to love the community. And if you don't, if there's something that's not adding up for you, if there's something that's not working right for you with the community, you need to email us. Let me give you my personal email address. It's patrick@PunkTorah.org. So if you don't feel a commitment right this moment to give, then we are doing something wrong. And you need to tell us what that is. Because the most important thing is that you matter. We're excited that you're here. I'm excited to be in a community with you. And I hope that you are excited as well. So please give. Please give. It will really, really make a huge difference. If not now, when? Right? So you can do that by clicking the donate button. You can do that through sending a check. You can also donate $5 a month in our recurring donation drive that we're doing, and I will actually I'll post that link right here. You can do that through PunkTorah as opposed to OneShul. Now, it's all the same, whether you give to PunkTorah or OneShul, it's all the same. If you give to OneShul, it goes directly to OneShul stuff. If you give to PunkTorah, it gets parsed out wherever it's necessary. But I will go on ahead and post that link. Thought I had it up here. See if I can find it real quick. Okay. That article is no longer featured anymore, so I will pull up that link by other means. But in any case, you can always just click on the donate button that's above. So, please donate. Donate your time as well. Not instead of, but as well. Because that's valuable as well. There are lots of great, smart people here in the community. You know, everyone's got a talent. Everyone's got something that they enjoy, something that they're, interested in, something that's meaningful to them, a piece of Jewish learning, something like that. There's lots and lots of ways that you can get involved. Teaching classes, leading services. I mean, really, there's just tons of fantastic ways that you can get involved. So I would really encourage you to please get involved. Please find ways to, get into the community, to learn about what we do, what we're about, and also to make the community whatever it is that you want it to be. Do you want to see more Shabbat services? Do you want to see more classes? Then let us know. So here's the link to that if you want to be part of the $5 a month club. If you want to donate just directly to OneShul and you want to use PayPal to do that, I've also included that link here in the chat room as well. You can give just a single amount that way. So, again, thank you so much for coming. Please come this Thursday, July 19th, 8 p.m. For online Rosh Chodesh services. Can't wait to see you there. Take care. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And as a special bonus, I have a practice of staying in the chat room after class. If you have any private questions, anything like that you'd like to talk about, if you'd like to Skype with me, I'm more than happy to Skype with you after class. I won't be streaming, but you'll still see me in the chat room. So just hit me up in the chat room if you want to talk. I prefer to do Skype as opposed to chatting because I have carpal tunnel now. But I would love to speak with you. So, again, thank you very much for coming to class, and I look forward to seeing you Thursday at Rosh Chodesh services. Take care.